Do you pray to the dumb ox enough? My name is Jacob Hubbard, and this is Incarnate Ministries, brought to you by St. Thomas Aquinas in Pilot Point, Texas. So excited to be bringing you all this series on the saints, and this is our second video in this series, but it's our first about an actual saint. Our first video was an intro video kind of explaining this series, its goals, and the disposition that I'm inviting you, the viewer, to have for the remainder of this series. So if you have not checked it out yet, please go and give it a listen. There's a link above the screen right now that should link you to the video. Hopefully future Jacob will remember to do that. So I figured that there's no better saint for us to start off with at our parish than St. Thomas Aquinas. And so that's who we're going to be talking about today. He's a saint that I fostered a very deep devotion to over the past years of my life, and has been a very big part of my own intellectual and thus faith formation. And so I'm really excited to share about his life, about some stories that I didn't even know until I began more in-depth researching his life. So St. Thomas Aquinas was born in 1225 AD to the Aquino family, which is a very rich and powerful family in Italy. And so they had connections with the Pope, and they're just a very powerful and well-known family line that he came from. And so he was educated at one of the best facilities for education at that time, which is Monte Cassino. Monte Cassino is actually the monastery that St. Benedict, that guy right back there, my confirmation saint, that's the one that he established way back in the day. And their formation was still continuing on in the 1200s when St. Thomas lived. So from a young age, his parents kind of knew that St. Thomas wasn't going to be an ordinary kid and pursue something political or something along those lines like his family probably had wanted. And they knew that he was probably going to tend toward the religious life. And they were okay with that as long as he was a Benedictine. They wanted him to be a Benedictine because Benedictines were socially accepted and had a lot of prestige to them, especially those who worked at Monte Cassino. And since they were a very prestigious family, they wanted their son to be in a prestigious position, maybe even one day abbot or head of the monastery at Monte Cassino. So St. Thomas Aquinas was educated at that monastery for 5 years in total, and it was found there that he had an absolutely incredible intellect, and he was offered to go study at a university in Naples, an offer which he did take. But before then, there's a story that I really like to emphasize about St. Thomas when he was growing up as a younger child. So he used to share a room with his sister, and there was one night when there was a very bad thunderstorm that rolled in and actually there's lightning that actually struck the side of the room that his sister was sleeping in, and she died from a lightning bolt. And he saw it happen before his very eyes. And so any time throughout his entire life, when he heard a thunderstorm or he heard thunder or saw that one was coming, he would get anxious and would often take refuge in a church and spend time before the Blessed Sacrament. And there's just something about that story, obviously very sad. There's something beautiful about it as well, something redemptive. And there's a lesson there for us of the absolute humility and obedience, the childlike faith that St. Thomas had. This is one of the most brilliant minds to ever have existed in the world. And he had the simple faith to run into his Father's arms whenever he would get anxious about something that he knew he probably had no real reason to get anxious about. Right? Just this simple invitation for us to be children in front of God, to have that childlike faith and obedience, that when we're scared, when we're anxious, when we're tired, when we're worried, we just go to the Lord and stretch out to Him, and then He meets us there and consoles us. So St. Thomas Aquinas went to the University of Naples, where he began his undergraduate studies. And undergraduate studies were different back then. They were 7 years long and much more intensive than a lot of the programs of today, because it was a lot more selective back then. Not many people got to go to the universities to begin with. And so it was there that he got his famous nickname that I started this video off with. His mother was of Norse descent, And so he had a lot of large bones in his family blood, and he inherited those. And he was also a very quiet and humble individual, and so he didn't speak very much unless spoken to. And so this kind of garnered him the nickname of the dumb ox, because he was large but also very quiet. But much to the surprise of those who branded this nickname on St. Thomas, there was a tradition back then at the universities where students would have to summarize the class lectures after the lecture had finished. They'd be invited, whoever it is, stand up and give me a summary of what you just heard. It's kind of scary, kind of glad we didn't have to do that today, right? But every single time that St. Thomas Aquinas was asked to do this and would stand up, everyone in the room would find that his articulations and his summaries would be more accurate and more easily understood and well thought out than the very lectures themselves. So it was so clear that St. Thomas was an absolutely brilliant intellect. And as often happens in college, there was a crazy tension that began here between the parents' will and the young man's will, right? And so during this time, St. Thomas Aquinas began fostering a devotion to the Dominicans. And Dominicans are not Benedictines. Dominicans really embraced, especially back then, poverty. And so St. Thomas Aquinas wanted that to be a part of what he embraced, because he saw the Lord in that. But obviously when his parents found out about that, they weren't exactly happy. And so, they did the normal parent thing and reached out to the Pope and the Archbishop of Naples, basically saying, "What is our son doing? You need to do something about this. You need to fix him." St. Thomas Aquinas kind of knows that things are heating up, and he's ready to just go ahead and swear his life away to the Dominicans. And so he starts to join them and is going to head on his way to Paris. Well, his mother heard this was happening. Of course, mothers know everything, right? And so she sent two of his brothers to intercept him on the road to Paris. And so he's kind of sneakily making his way to Paris, hoping that his parents won't notice. And then all of a sudden, boom, on that road, there are his brothers, who are also of Norse descent, rather strong and large. And so they forcefully take St. Thomas and throw him into a castle, I kid you not, like literally they put him in a tower. And basically that was a very long time out until he sobered up about this whole Dominican craze and went back to what they wanted, which was him to be a Benedictine. And so one of the ways that they thought to get through to St. Thomas was to send his sisters up to show him that he was being rather unruly and not thinking properly, which is quite a statement given St. Thomas Aquinas. Well, anyways, so they head up and they visit with him multiple times, trying to convince him to either drop the entire idea of priesthood and monastic life entirely, or to at least go into the order of the Benedictines. Well, what ended up happening was that St. Thomas Aquinas was so ardent with his desire to be a Dominican that he convinced his sisters that it was the right thing for him to do. And they start bringing him up philosophy books so he can actually make use of his long time out in the middle of a castle, right? And so they bring him up the Metaphysics of Aristotle, which became very, very influential for him, the sentences of Peter Lombard, and the Bible. And he began memorizing very large chunks of text from all three of those. And again, that's going to be very significant in his later systematic theology and philosophy that he develops. So the whole sister thing didn't work out. So the brothers take things into their own hands, and they send up a promiscuous woman to St. Thomas Aquinas' tower, thinking that she would be able to break him of his fervor and turn him back to the ways of the world. Well, I don't think they knew who they were messing with, because when they sent the lady up to the tower, St. Thomas Aquinas grabbed a hot iron brand from the fireplace and drove her out of the room. And then he collapsed and began to weep, because all he wanted was chastity, and that's what he was repeating to the Lord was, "Lord, give me chastity. Lord, give me chastity." Again, we see this childlike faith of this huge and brilliant man, right? This childlike tenderness and obedience before the Lord. And he's just weeping. And then he falls into a deep sleep, and an angel appears on either side of him and girds him with a belt. And this belt is rather tight, and it's so tight that it actually wakes him up. But from this moment on, St. Thomas Aquinas told his confessor at the end of his life, from this moment on, he never experienced another sexual temptation. So obviously that was the Lord answering his prayer right then and there. And I love to think about this because St. Thomas Aquinas eventually did become a priest. I love to think about this in reference to modern priests today. Now, I don't know if many of you know this, but one of the things that the priest does before he begins the Mass is he puts on his alb, which is the white robe he wears underneath the chasuble, which is the colored robe that we usually see. And he puts something on over the alb called the cincture. And the cincture is a rope belt that is wrapped around the priest before every single liturgy. And it's the belt of chastity. And so I just love that St. Thomas Aquinas received that in a supernatural way, and every single priest ever has. And they remind themselves of their supernatural belt of chastity in their preparation for every single liturgy. Isn't that cool? So after the attempts of his sisters and his brothers, the Pope reprimanded St. Thomas Aquinas' parents for basically being crazy. And so they kind of let off a little bit, loosen the reins, enough for some Dominicans who were disguised to go to the tower and help St. Thomas Aquinas sneak out. And so he sneaks out, and then he begins taking off for Sicily. So St. Thomas Aquinas heads to Sicily in just his simple Dominican attire with a breviary and a satchel, and that's it. And he has to go over the Alps to do this. It's insane. Again, just his inner strength and his childlike faith and trust in the Lord, which I really think are actually the basis for his intellect, that actually allowed him to be so incredibly intelligent and so incredibly wise, because he understood where intelligence and wisdom came from and to whom they were ordered. So he arrives in Sicily to study under Saint Albert the Great, who is another absolutely transformative intellect in that time of the church. It's actually crazy how many insanely brilliant minds existed in the 1200s. Because then at that same place, he meets another saint, Saint Bonaventure. And if St. Thomas Aquinas is the light of the Dominican order, then St. Bonaventure is the light of the Franciscan order. What I mean by that is that they really emanate the true heart of their orders, the true intellect and the true wisdom behind their orders. And both of them wrote incredibly influential works that went on to be passed down to this day and still studied even now. So St. Thomas Aquinas finished up his bachelor's, and then he began to preach alongside St. Albert the Great, who'd made him his pupil at this point. And again, something really cool about being a pupil is it wasn't just like something you'd meet with a professor once or twice a week or anything like that. No, when you were a pupil, it's much like being a disciple in the time of Jesus. You were chosen, handpicked by the scholar. And then you would do everything with them. You would have meals with them. You'd sleep in the same house as them. You would go and do everything together, preaching, studying, whatever it was, you would tag along so that eventually you could become them. That was the goal. That's the goal of the disciples, right? It's the goal of us as disciples is to become Jesus, to die to ourselves. We must decrease and he must increase. And so it's so cool that we see St. Thomas Aquinas taking that on in an incarnational way with St. Albert the Great. So he began to write treatises and he began to preach in German, which is the vernacular of the time, on the scriptures. And his preachings would bring together so many big crowds because they were so just struck, they're awestruck by St. Thomas Aquinas' incredible reason and his ability to articulate very complex concepts in a simplified and united and systematic manner. And so he began to preach, and it actually began to make him sort of famous. And he was invited by a duchess actually to to preach on how she should deal with the Jewish community in her realm. And St. Thomas Aquinas advocated for humanity and tolerance, which I think is so amazing. And so word of him began to spread all the way up to the Pope himself, who'd obviously heard of the earlier whole situation from the parents' side as far as who St. Thomas was and wanting to join the Dominicans instead of the Benedictines. But the Pope actually invited St. Thomas to a position in the papal court. And before this, St. Thomas Aquinas had been preaching since the age of 28 without a doctor in theology. And you weren't allowed to preach usually until you were 35 and had the doctor in theology. St. Thomas Aquinas got his doctor at 32, and so he was obviously younger, and he was still preaching before then. So everyone knew his talent, and so it made sense that he was invited onto the papal court. And he began to form people there intentionally for the priesthood, which he was ordained a priest at this point as well. And on the note of the priesthood, his biographer said that often he would be dissolved in tears when celebrating the Mass. That again, this such brilliant mind would just weep at the beautiful mysteries of the liturgy. Again, such a beautiful witness to the childlike obedience and faith that St. Thomas possessed, that we can aspire to. So while St. Thomas was at the papal court, there was a big theological question, and we'll get a little nerdy here, and so we're going to kind of explain it, but it was about the Eucharist, and it was asking whether the accidents of the Eucharist changed when the bread became the body of Jesus. What does that mean? Well, there's this distinction between substance and accidents, philosophically. Substance is simply what a thing is. And we know that that changes in the Eucharist because the bread, that's the substance, becomes the body of Jesus. The bread becomes Jesus. So the substance changes. It's a substantial change. That's actually why we say transubstantiation, right? It's a changing across states, right? That's what the word really means. So that makes sense. The substance does change. Now, the accidents are the things that we see, right? The things that we experience. So those are things like the smell, the taste, the feel, the look. Those are the accidents, and they help us to identify what a substance is. We can identify a substance usually by its accidents, right? I can go outside, I can feel a tree, I can look at a tree, I can, smell a tree if it's a pine tree or whatever, right? And I can know, okay, that's a tree, right? It's the accidents that tell me what the substance is. And so the question was, do the accidents in the Eucharist change when the substance changes? And St. Thomas Aquinas reasoned that the accidents do not change, which makes sense because usually in the Mass, we don't see the accidents change. There have been miracles where the accidents change and the substance takes on the accidents of literal human flesh, right? The miracle of Lanciano, for example. But usually the accidents of bread remain. So it still looks like bread. It still tastes like bread. It still smells like bread. It still appears to be bread. The accidents are the same, but the substance has changed. And so he wrote a thesis on that, explaining the theology and the reasoning behind that. And everyone took it as truth once he put it out, which is incredible. And I love that he put it out by placing it upon the altar and consecrating his treatise to the Lord and then reading it to the general public. Again, he was correctly ordered. He was the Lord's first, and the Lord gave him all these incredible gifts that then he went to actualize to the best of his abilities, always looking to serve the Lord in what he did. So after St. Thomas Aquinas wrote this thesis, the Lord visited him and told him, "Thomas, you have written well of my body." And the Lord took him up into ecstasy, and he began to literally levitate in the place that he was praying. And he levitated for such a length of time that the brothers in his community began to gather around and be like, "Look, St. Thomas Aquinas is literally floating." It's crazy. Another testament to God's grace working miraculously through St. Thomas in incredible ways that far exceeded his own intellect's ability. So years after this, St. Thomas Aquinas was working on one of his greatest works, which is called Summa contra Gentiles, which is basically a summary of theology against people who did not believe. And it builds a beautiful argument that begins from the state of the world to that there needs to be a cause. And then from that idea of a cause, it reasons that that cause must be the Judeo-Christian God. So he was praying in the chapel while working on this work, And the Lord visited him again and said, "Thomas, you have written well of me. What is it that you desire?" And this is actually said out loud from the crucifix to St. Thomas. It wasn't just in his head, because there was a sacristan in the church at that time who heard from the crucifix that being said. And he also heard St. Thomas Aquinas' simple reply, "Non nisi te, Domine," which means nothing but thyself, Lord. And that's all that St. Thomas wanted, was just Christ. That was always his aim, was union with Jesus. Shortly after this, he was working on his greatest work, which is Summa Theologiae, which is Summary of Theology. And this was actually literally one of the 3 works brought to the Council of Trent, which is one of the biggest church moments in church history. It was the Bible, it was the letters and exhortations of past popes, and it was the Summa Theologiae. That is how incredibly significant this book is. And he's working on this, and he celebrates Mass and receives a vision so profound that he puts down his pen for good. And when he was asked later if he was ever going to begin writing again, this was his reply: "The end of my labors is come. All that I have written seems to me so much straw after the things that have been revealed to me." Shortly after this, St. Thomas Aquinas passed at the age of 48, and he was singing a hymn of praise as his last words. And St. Thomas Aquinas actually wrote a few of the hymns that we use today, such as Tantum Ergo or Pange Lingua. Those hymns that we sing during Eucharistic adoration, those were written by St. Thomas Aquinas, which is great. And so he passed at the age of 48, and the day that he passed, St. Albert the Great, who was on a completely different side of the country at that point, groaned out and cried out and knew that St. Thomas had passed. The Lord had revealed it to him. We can't speak enough on the incredible importance of St. Thomas Aquinas to our Catholic faith and tradition. He literally changed the trajectory of our intellectual tradition. Because before, it was an Augustinian trajectory, which combined the thinking of Plato with Christianity. And it's beautiful, there's so much depth there. But St. Thomas Aquinas looked to combine the thinking of Aristotle, who was more of a natural scientist, with the Christian and Catholic tradition. And that's so significant because he showed us that our faith is reasonable, that our faith is grounded in sense experience, that we can build from the state of the world as is to there needing to be a first cause, and that cause being God. It's such an incredible insight, and it's something that we hold on to. His arguments we hold on to and defend to this very day. In fact, many of the arguments that I gave in the Exodus series were from St. Thomas Aquinas. Something else that I've already mentioned a few times, but that I absolutely love about St. Thomas is his incredible humility. And I have a few stories to articulate that. There's one time when he was pronouncing Latin publicly, and he was corrected incorrectly about his pronunciation. And he knew that that person who corrected him was incorrectly correcting him. I know that's weird, but it works, right? And rather than correct the man who incorrectly corrected him, he said the Latin incorrectly. And later he was approached about it, and this is what he said: "It matters little whether a syllable be long or short, but it matters much to practice humility and obedience." Again, that broader context that St. Thomas had, that was ordered toward growing closer to our Lord above all else and never being prideful in of himself. Another time they had a visitor at his monastery, and the visitor picked him out, not knowing who he was, to carry around his luggage while he went around town. And St. Thomas Aquinas was lame at this point in his life, so he couldn't physically keep up with the layperson that was visiting. And the layperson was getting short and kind of angry with St. Thomas and was being snappy and made some, uncouth remarks. But St. Thomas Aquinas just took it. And eventually he figured out who he was dealing with, and he came before St. Thomas, was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Please don't write a book about me," right? And St. Thomas simply said to the man, "I am the one to blame. I am only sorry I could not be more useful." And when he was asked by his brothers why he did not reveal to this man who he was, St. Thomas Aquinas said, "Obedience is the perfection of the religious life. For by it a man submits to man for the love of God, even as God made himself obedient to men for their salvation. The story of the Christian life, of Jesus' life, is a story of obedience. He was obedient even unto death. He made himself obedient unto man because he wanted to show us that there is nothing that could corrupt him. There is nothing that could dissolve him from himself, that could take away or destroy his divinity. And he wanted to redeem every facet of our being. And so there's always this invitation for us to see ourselves as who we are, which is incorruptible in Jesus' eyes, in his name, by our nature. And so we don't need to fear being obedient. We don't need to fear making ourselves little. For in that being little, we are made great. We are a witness to God because we show others that we are not afraid of being small. And what's more powerful than that, of not fearing anything, especially not humiliation? So how can we be more obedient like St. Thomas? Maybe we can be more intellectually obedient. Maybe there's something that we know we disagree with on the church. We disagree with the church's stance. And so maybe it's time for us to repent of that and to research the church's stance more in depth, or to reach out to our pastors, our priests, or our youth ministers and have a conversation about the church's teaching so that we can come to a greater understanding and thus a greater obedience, so we can give more fully and completely of ourselves to the Lord who's given himself completely to us. And how can we be more obedient to those in our lives that we love and trust? Maybe when we come home, the first thing we do is do the dishes, or cook, or just do something small. Be obedient to one another, and in doing so, make ourselves small and glorify the Lord as St. Thomas Aquinas did. Again, every intellectual pursuit needs to begin out of obedience and faith to the Lord, because the Lord is our beginning and our end. May it be so with us. Thank you all, and have a wonderful week.